Okay. Before I hand over to Brian, I just want to really touch on some of the reasons as to why TRB chose to do this piece of research. We've got a great survey run by GfK which produces the number of people listening to radio, but we wanted to actually delve into show the effectiveness of radio. And it's our belief within the radio industry there's a high degree of misattribution that radio suffers from. Because radio is often consumed in a passive way, i.e. we're doing something else while we're listening to the radio, when a traditional piece of research is done asking to recall what triggered your purchase, radio often suffers from that lack of attribution because it's not top of mind, it's not instantly recalled compared to some other media. And this misattribution was backed up really by a survey that was done in the UK a couple of years ago by Ubiquity. And they were looking at 5 key attributes of a branding campaign, so targetability, the return on investment, emotional response, brand salience, and the reach. And in each of those 5 elements, they measured what the evidence suggested the effectiveness of different media was, and they measured what the perception of advertisers and agencies was in terms of ranking the media's performance against those elements. And each of those 5 key categories, radio ranked far lower in the perception versus what the evidence displayed. So therefore, that really led us to, we want to do a piece of research that can provide some factual evidence of backing up the effectiveness of radio. And when we first started talking to Neuro-Insight and Brian, what impressed us about the potential for this research was it was a science-based approach that drove data and it gave us evidence. So it was a logical step to show the effectiveness of the radio campaigns. To delve into the nuts and bolts of that, I'll pass right over to Brian. Brian.
Okay. Is it just one click? Great. Okay, thank you, Peter. It's always good to see you on a video looking about 5 kilos heavier than you think you are. But I'll try not to let it dent my confidence as we kick off. So we'll start by considering the why and the how of neuroscience. It takes a bit of explaining, and then we'll jump into the study findings. Point out anything in particular? Yeah, I've got the green. That'd be why. Okay, so to begin with, the basis of using neuroscience to understand more about media or advertising or anything really is that you need to recognize that 95% of our decision making is in our subconscious. And our response to advertising is the same. 95% of our response to advertising that might lead to future behavior lies within our subconscious. So, we continually ask people what they think about how a stimulus might impact them, but they really can't say because they're dealing with they refer to their conscious mind. And this is where neuroscience comes to the fore. We tap into the brain, and we tap into brain processing, and we can measure responses to any sort of stimulus. We tend to focus on advertising work or work with media owners. We also do some stuff in user experience. So essentially, you're getting to the heart of what's really happening when someone's experiencing something. The approach that we take has been, the methodology and technology has been developed by a professor of neuroscience over in Melbourne. He's now the chairman of our organization. And so everything we do is backed up by scientific validation. There's a process within the science world where you publish papers and your peers review them. So our whole approach to applying neuroscience to the sort of study that you've seen today has been essentially approved by the science community. We've also done work over the years trying to validate, because inevitably everyone's a bit skeptical when there's something that's slightly different to their view of the norm and how to do things. So we've done some work with clients over the years to try and validate the sales, both with regards to, we've worked with brands and taken the learnings that we've got with working with brands and their creative But we also worked with a number of media owners trying to understand and sort of rank our findings as to reliability and accuracy. And this is just one example, but so this was with a big advertiser, big FMCG advertiser, and we looked across 15 campaigns, and essentially what you can see on the horizontal axis is their sales effectiveness score that they developed through an econometric model, and then we compared it with the Neuro score, and essentially you saw a really powerful line of best fit, an 86% correlation. Another way to say this is that 86% of the sales outcomes you can track directly back to the memory encoding measure. So the more work that we do with this with clients, they start to appreciate just how robust the use of the neuroscience is. So you might not be able to see all the detail on there, but essentially this is what we're measuring. The sensors, we fit a cap with 20 sensors, and we fit a visor in the fieldwork. The sensors are placed in regions that have a known cognitive function, so we know parts of the brain. If we can measure what's happening there, we can determine what we're measuring, and we can share that with you. I have to say, the caps that we fit on people's heads, it's easier if you've got a haircut like mine. People with lots of hair, there's a lot of fiddling around because you have to get the sensors in the right place, and we have the technology that can tell us whether the cap's properly fitted. So it can go on for quite a while. So what do we actually measure? So we've got the headsets on people's heads. We sit them in front of a piece of content, a TV show with ads, a car journey, listening to radio. Moment by moment, we're able to measure things like engagement. To us, engagement means the subconscious has decided that this content is relevant to me. I should be paying attention. So it's not necessarily, it's not being entertained. They see it as an important message. Approach withdrawal is essentially positive or negative. Emotional intensity speaks for itself. And then the long-term memory, that is the moment when the brain identifies something of being high importance that it needs to use for the future, and so it stores it into memory encoding. You're going to hear me say memory encoding about 7,000 times during the session. I've probably already said about 1,000. But this is why. So the truth is that it's only memories that drive future behavior. And so the decisions that you make in the future as to whether it's what you might drink, what you might eat, what car you might buy, that is all driven in the subconscious by things that have been triggered into memory encoding. The brain only stores what it deems to be of future importance. Historically, the science community thought that memory was a collection of memories as such, but it's not. The long-term memory is there to inform future behavior. And actually, the more that it's studied, memory as a use of recalling something from the past is actually wholly unreliable. With regards to what influences your memory encoding, if you're listening to a radio ad, it could be a number of factors. It's your life's experiences that are stored in the subconscious, this fast-moving part of the brain. It'll be how you're feeling, how emotional you are, what personal drives you've got, whether it's relevant to you. But it's important that we're always talking to clients about the fact that if a message has not gone into long-term memory, it cannot affect future behavior. And because we can measure the experience moment by moment, say through a radio ad, we can actually identify which moments have triggered into long-term memory and which the audience have lost. We often say to clients that memory encoding drives mental availability, i.e. the probability that a buyer will notice, recognize, or think of a brand in a buying situation. And much to many clients' frustration, it also drives all of these other factors. So you can't recall, you can't have a preference, you can't have purchase intent if your long-term memory encoding has not been triggered by a piece of content. This is how we traditionally show the data. You've got two lines on the chart there. The red is detailed memory, which I'll come on to in a bit. The black is global memory. And we essentially are able to track, moment by moment, how is memory encoding performing. Behind this, we're also monitor engagement, and we monitor emotional, because they tell us a lot about why at this point in the experience memory encoding has been triggered. But as I said several times, memory encoding is the key one. That's the one that drives behavior. So now onto the study methodology. So we did the fieldwork in Auckland. We had almost 200 participants, and we had 3 different cells. And we had 3 different cells structured so that we could try and isolate the priming effect. So we could see how radio performed first, and then how radio performed if it was primed by TV or by social media. What we got, with all the studies that we do, we try and make it as natural as it can be. So the participants come in, and in each cell we got them watching a car journey whilst listening to the radio. We got them, and the car journey, they're in the sort of driver's perspective. We got them to watch a TV show, and we got them to follow a Facebook scroll. We don't tell them why they're doing it. We don't explain what the research is about. We can ask questions if the client wants us to, but we often don't, because it's wholly unreliable. And with regards to the study, if there are any stats people in, I've been told to say the data was calculated to the 95% confidence level, so you can relax. Cool. So I'm sure you've just asked yourself, well, why did we get people to sit and follow a car journey while listening to the radio? I can answer that question. So it's about mirror neurons. So if you were to watch on TV or on your phone someone performing an everyday task that's familiar to you, something in your brain is triggered, and it's the mirror neurons, and essentially your brain state emulates how you would feel if you were performing that activity. So it needs to be a day-to-day activity that you're very familiar with. And so the reason we get people to just watch a car journey and listen to the radio is that there's lots of science around it that confirms that your brain state will be pretty similar to how it would be if you were driving that car. And it works only if the task is familiar. So moving on to the study findings. You'll be pleased to know that there were 3 major study findings. This is the first one. You'll be pleased to know that based on the data, radio in the study is highly effective for both call to action and branding. I don't know to what degree that's a clash with how a lot of people see it in the market, probably perceived to be more around call to action, but the data clearly illustrated that radio can brand just as effectively. This is probably a good time to talk a bit more about memory. So within the memory encoding, we've got 2 types. We've got detailed, which is what it sounds like, very detailed, very specific, perhaps particular messages. If there's words or text, the detailed part of the brain focus on what is actually being said. Whereas global memory encoding is more around how people feel, it's around connotation, it's around mood, and if you are thinking of language, it's more around the meaning of what was said. So, and you're constantly in a flux between detail and global memory. You rarely sit in the middle on the line. It can be driven by how you feel, but it's often driven by what you're experiencing, what your stimulus is. So what we saw across the ads, and this is an average across the ads, we achieved a rating of 0.67, which is pretty good. That's pretty high. Once you get to 0.68, you're in the highly effective zone that we've developed through working with clients over the years. And certainly versus the benchmark in our other radio studies, you're above the 0.64. So that was average memory. When we look at the average memory, but at peak branding, we've achieved 0.65 in the study versus a benchmark of 0.59. So again, versus other markets, it's pretty good performance. But I think the most interesting point is this one, which is when you remove the average and you look at all of the individual radio ads, at peak branding, 2/3 of them hit the 0.68 memory encoding. And therefore, that's where we're happy with the earlier slide to make the claim. A radio is highly effective at both global memory and driving detailed memory. We think part of the explanation for this is some work that's been done by an academic in the UK, a guy called Robert Heath. It's always good to have someone else who's fairly highly regarded in the field who seems to be coming to the same conclusions. And his conclusion is that actually low involvement brain processing, so the type which audiences are like to express when you're listening to the radio, can actually be highly effective and more effective than the lean-in sort of intense media engagement. And it's to do with the fact that the brain isn't having to work very hard. The brain is very relaxed and actually can make the brain more efficient. And that's where we think the link is, that the passive experience can actually drive a higher level of engagement, higher memory encoding, and the sorts of results that we just saw in the study. So, confidently say radio has high capability for brand building and as a call to action. I guess what we did see throughout the study, and Ralph's probably going to touch on this sort of thing as we go through the morning, is it's all about the creative. You're giving them the platform, but certain creative really utilised the opportunity, and others, it could have been better. The second major finding is that radio can drive stronger performance in other media. We'll just talk a bit about the nature of memory. So when the brain is exposed to an ad and it encodes the experience in memory for the first time, the neural network in the brain slightly rewires itself. So there's a change. When something new is added, or when you're exposed to the same experience, the same ad, you're essentially encountering a different brain. The brain's already changed, and therefore the response is likely to be different. And the relevance to the priming section is that essentially is what we saw. We saw responses to content that hadn't been primed that were very different when they had been primed. And it's all about the brain building on its individual experiences. So with regards to the priming, radio performed really well with priming, you'll be pleased to know. So we saw an increase in average memory encoding for TV when an ad was played on the radio first and then watched on TV. That was across the average, and those were 13% increase for detail, 8% increase for global. They're quite significant increases. When we look at peak branding and the impact of radio priming TV, we actually saw an enormous increase in detail, plus 31%, and plus 4% for global. So this is, and we'll come on to a few more examples. This is the impact of having consumed the media in this low involvement, passive but highly effective state. It's then driving bigger results, increases in effectiveness in the other media. When we looked at social media was primed by radio and TV, and again we saw increases for social media, plus 8% on detail and plus 13% for global. That's an average number. And then when we looked at peak branding, again, pretty impressive increases in effectiveness when the social media have been primed by radio and TV. The third and final major finding is around the consistency of the creative, which we can see through some of these examples provides what we probably call a layering effect, and it is driving effectiveness. I better explain it. In this TV example, what we can see is memory encoding triggered at key moments in the creative when the TV ad was seen first versus when it had been primed. So if you can see, there are two orange bars. I'll have to explain it. So essentially, there's a red peak just here and a red peak just at the end there, and this is the television ad. So there's very high important peaks in detailed memory encoding. They weren't there when the TV ad was seen on its own, first of all. So the experience of listening to the radio ad in advance, in this low-level, passive but effective neuro state, has then meant that when the TV ad is seen after the radio ad, we see two quite big spikes. One is a key message and one is at the audio logo and branding. So it completely changes the complexion of how that ad performed. There are orange boxes around those key points on here, but for some reason we can't see them. Or I can't see them. Okay, so that's one example. This is the same creative actually, and we highlighted two other moments, but something different was going on within here. So, sort of just before 15 seconds and around 20 seconds, what we saw was when the TV ad was seen on its own, unprimed, memory encoding was okay, but not an awful lot of the black, the global memory encoding, the how do people feel and the mood and the connotation. But having heard the ad on radio and then seeing it on TV, we see the two black spikes there in global memory. In terms of what we usually measure, they are enormous. Well, one of them, as you can see, has gone off the chart. The software couldn't keep it in. And we have to conclude it's because the audience have seen the radio ad, they've been highly immersed and engaged in it, they've already peaked in detailed memory encoding, and so when they experience the ad the second time round, they're familiar with the ad, they're familiar with the detail, they then really engage in the global memory encoding and how they feel about what they're seeing. So yeah, just another example, and there were quite a few, there's the only two we'll go through, of where the consistency of creative had a massive impact when you combine it with priming. And the more consistent, it was fairly linear, the more it's consistent, the more effective. And we've talked a lot about memory encoding, but as I said, we measure engagement and we measure emotional intensity and other things. This was also the case with regards to the priming for all of the other areas. So the black shape there in the middle is television unprimed. When it was then primed by radio, you can see every single measure has increased. Particularly the big gap in memory left brain there. That was the two spikes that we just saw. But it's not just memory encoding, it's impacting everything. And then finally, this is the same chart, the same measure essentially, looking at key moments and looking at the impact of priming by radio. And it was consistent across all four sectors. Retail creative, there were increases in certain areas, but not in memory encoding. But across the others, very effective tactic to have radio, perhaps, if not before, out at the same time as TV, and to be looking at opportunities for consistent creative to drive these sorts of results, because they're very powerful results in terms of neuroscience. And I think that's it. I'm wrapping up and handing back to Peter. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Brian. Look, I appreciate there's an awful lot involved in that. We will have a booklet, soft copy, that we'll be able to distribute later this week to each of you here. We'll be sending it to your email addresses that you've registered with. Just to really, what does that mean? What are the implications for clients and agencies? Well, I think the first one that really stands out was that radio should be considered more in that set for branding. I think radio's always been used as a call to action, and the effectiveness is generally considered as its strength. But what this evidence really shows is that actually, you know what, it's also really good at that encoding for branding also. Secondly, look, what this evidence shows is that radio should be used prior to TV to generate a far better TV performance. Look, realistically, that's probably not going to happen. I mean, campaigns are more likely to run simultaneously. So I think what this shows is that, again, radio forms part of that mix. It just enhances every other media you use. So, for example, running radio ads at breakfast or the drive home and then seeing the TV ad in the evening, that's going to create the most effective use of your TV campaign, enhanced by radio. We've seen this in other studies previously where it's been called the multiplier effect. And thirdly, it's that keeping the consistent creative across the different media. It's having that iconic sonic trigger that you hear it on the radio and then you can watch it on the TV and you go, it's like that's there, it's in your brain. It's sort of slightly intuitive, but it's great to get some evidence that backs it up and delivering some of the results that we've seen there. So, Brian, thank you very much for talking us through that. As I say, we're working on and it's just about complete, a final document, which will be a soft copy that we're going to circulate, which has got all this detail plus some more in terms of some of the more detail, some of the more complex nature of, as you can imagine, it was quite a sophisticated study that happened. So that will be going out later this week.